Dear follower, I'm sure this has happened to you at some point. You're playing a game of chess and suddenly you think, for example, my opponent is going to play this. If I capture, they'll do that, and I'll end up with a better position. Well, the thing is, when we're playing, we can't review the game, for example, with analysis engines. Therefore, what we evaluate is simply what we believe, not the absolute truth. And many times, and here's the heart of the matter, we make mistakes in our evaluation. In today's lesson, we're going to examine this specific situation in detail, and we're going to try to fix it a bit so we can significantly improve our chess level. I'm bringing you a gameplay between the 8-time Russian champion Peter Svidler, an incredibly formidable and world-class grandmaster, and with the black pieces, the very famous Michael Adams. In other words, this is a match played at the very highest level of professional chess. But what's most important are the valuable lessons we're going to take from it. If you really enjoy it, leave a like if you want more videos like this, and let's get started. The game started with a Ruy Lopez opening. I hope that by now we all know which opening this is. Knight to f3, attacking the d5 pawn. Knight to c6, defending it. And of course, this bishop to b5, which is characteristic of the Spanish opening or Ruy Lopez. The idea is simple, right? If this is the defending knight, then I go straight to attack it. Obviously, there's a ton of theory after this move, but at least now we know the basics of the Spanish opening. A 6, pushing his bishop away. This is the single most popular move of all when challenging the Spanish opening. You should definitely know that the exchange is possible, but it is not necessarily considered the sharpest or most aggressive line available. Surely many of you are thinking, I take out the knight and then capture this pawn. But that's not possible because simply, after capturing with the pawn, once we recapture this pawn with the knight, there would be the move queen to d4, attacking both the pawn and the knight, giving black a certain advantage. Therefore, right here, after the specific move of pawn to a6, which effectively pushes the bishop back, the bishop simply retreats to a safe square while still very much maintaining the pressure on this knight. If in the future, for example, this pawn becomes defended, now there really is a threat to capture and capture, thus winning a pawn. Black chooses the Berlin defense, a very solid defense. This is the defense that the legendary Grandmaster Vladimir Kramnik chose in his historic World Championship match against Garry Kasparov. And in fact, he actually went on to win the entire thing. He became world champion using this defense. So, what can I say, right? It's an extremely strong defense. I'm going to move forward a bit because this isn't really the most important part of the video. Although it's always good to learn from every single move in the game, and especially from the plans. White castles and bishop to c5, a slightly, let's say, novel variation. This game was played in the year 2000, okay? In case you want to study it there. Normally, this Berlin defense is played with the bishop on e7, the pawn on d6, and then castling. What's different about this with the bishop on c5? Well, like everything in life, dear friends, it has its pros and cons. The pros are pretty obvious. This bishop is much more active here than it would be, for example, on e7, where it runs into its own knight. Plus, it can always retreat to this square, to this gap created by the black pieces on a7, and it will always be aiming at the king. So, for example, this pawn will be completely stuck. A typical example that happens when the bishop is placed on this diagonal or on this diagonal for the white pieces is that if at any point we move this h3 pawn, this square becomes completely undefendable right now. Why? Because this pawn doesn't defend it, and this one, even though it looks like it does, actually doesn't either, because the bishop pins the king, so the king can't move to defend this square. All of this is pretty interesting, isn't it? What are the downsides of having the bishop on c5? Because, of course, there are also disadvantages. The most important one is that the king will be much more exposed. It won't be as well defended by the bishop directly toward its knight, right? For example, some attacks from this bishop, like bishop to g5, targeting this knight, would already pin the queen. And then you could try to threaten with this knight. And well, we'd have a super interesting game, right? The pros and cons of this move. Quickly, the white player, Svidler, wants to take advantage of this central situation with the undefended bishop, trying to put pressure on it with c3. c3 is a move with a double purpose. The first is to give this bishop on c2 an escape route, in case at some point black tries to play b5 and knight to a5 to win this bishop. You should know that both in the Ruy Lopez opening and in the Spanish opening, our best weapon is practically the light squared bishop, also known as the Spanish bishop. So we should always try to take great care of it, making sure to leave this little space so it can be repositioned at some point. Another function of this c3 move is to support the pawn that in the future might break through with d4, or who knows, alternatively, also playing in the gioco piano style of the Italian game with d3 and having all the squares well defended. And the last function of this c3 move is to prevent the knight from jumping into the center of the board. Therefore, we can see that every move makes a lot of sense, and these kinds of players didn't just make moves for the sake of it. The game continues with b5, where we got to retreat the bishop, to b3 or to c2. Both would be possible, but you should know that if, for example, we retreated here, it could always be targeted by a knight jump. Literally, we can just put it directly on c2, where it's true that it seems to be blocked by the pawn structure, but you never know when we might open up the center, and these bishops could attack directly toward black's kingside. The game continues with d6, and white could make a lot of moves here. That's true. They could play, for example, d3, so that now they could develop the bishop and the knight. They could play d4 directly, but they go for the move a4, an extremely interesting move. First of all, it poses a serious threat. What threat? You can see it, right? Pawn takes pawn, winning a pawn, since this pawn couldn't be recaptured because the rook is undefended on the a8 file. Therefore, black has to do something. Either react here or move this bishop so that the queen can defend the rook. Obviously, as you already know, every pawn move creates weaknesses, and we have to think very carefully about all pawn moves because they're the only piece that can't move backward. So it seems like a much better idea to develop this bishop. But okay, where are we going to develop it? Well, it seems that the most active square of all, without a doubt, is this one right here, right? Bishop to g4. Look, the idea is obvious. To put pressure on the knight, since it's pinned, the queen is pinned, right? Let's say. And if this queen ever tries to break the pin, then we could capture this knight and completely ruin the pawn structure around white's castling. And this would probably be a big advantage for black. The game continues with d3, a solid, calm response in the gioco piano style, but one that could become dangerous later on. The idea is clear, to develop the knight and the bishop. With this pawn on d2, you can't develop it. For now, white has all their pawns well placed. Now, after this castling, h3, asking this bishop what it wants to do. Logically, they're not going to exchange for the knight because that would improve our queen's position. They'd lose the strength of the pin, which is important, and they'd also lose the bishop pair. Therefore, bishop takes knight is a move that has 3 drawbacks and doesn't offer any added value. Therefore, without a doubt, the best move is to retreat the bishop to the only square that keeps the pressure on the knight and the queen. The game continues with knight from b to d2, even though at first glance it seems like we're delaying the development of our dark squared bishop. All of this is very, very theoretical in these types of structures. The knight comes out via b2 to also try to defend this knight. And not only that, but in some cases, this knight tries to execute this typical maneuver, rook to e1, knight to f1, knight to g3, from where it puts a lot of pressure on this bishop, which should retreat. And then the knights usually come to f5, to the beloved and at the same time hated, at least for black pieces, the Kasparov office, which is placing a knight on f5 in these types of positions. Notice how interesting these kinds of knight maneuvers are, right? How interesting it is to understand these kinds of games so deeply, because you really learn a lot. And you'll see that today's game is going to blow your mind, because very soon a lot of pieces will be exchanged, and in just a few moves, there will be very few pieces left on the board, but with an extreme level of positional understanding. Look at black's move, b4. What do you think about this move? Well, it's interesting. I'm not going to say it's not. And we always have to keep these kinds of moves in mind and try to analyze things very, very, very carefully. The idea is that now, if we don't do anything and just stick to our plan, for example, rook to e1 to bring the knight over, they're going to close this pawn structure with a 5, and we're letting them gain space completely for free. And we don't want that. So look at this. When this b4 is played, here, Svidler, the 8-time Russian champion, which is no small feat, understands perfectly that he can't allow a5 because a5 would give his opponent a really strong pawn structure with a lot of space on the queen side. And when these two pieces move back, they could even push further, so his opponent would end up in a really good position. And he plays the move a5, which does two things. First, it leaves this b4 pawn completely isolated, and second, it fixes the weakness on a 6. What does it mean to fix a weakness? Well, it means not letting it advance in life because it's going to have this wall in front of it and won't be able to move forward. And as you can see, it's a weakness because its partner has advanced too far and left it completely alone. It has recklessly thrown itself into the battle flank and left it completely alone in the rear. And you'll see how well Svidler takes advantage of this, going straight for the attack. Here, the black player, Adams, defends this pawn with threats of capturing and opening the file for his rook. It makes perfect sense, but we can already see that with the move queen to e2, pressure is being applied, keeping an eye on the a6 square, which is completely weak. There are threats like d4, threatening a central breakthrough, and also targeting the a6 pawn, which is completely weak. Pawn takes pawn on c3 to exchange this completely weak pawn and to open the file for the black pieces. This is correct. And here the player with the black pieces decides it's time to break the center with d5. All right, here many of you might be thinking, what do I do? How? Do I just let him take? Do I just ignore everything, right? But notice that these kinds of really strong players understand something. What does every pawn move do? It creates weaknesses. And what weakness does it leave behind? The e5 pawn? It was perfectly defended, but with this advance now, what happens to this pawn? It's been left completely alone and unprotected. Therefore, the white player asks themselves, are they threatening anything? If they capture here, but I really have it super mega defended with the pawn, the knight, the bishop, and the queen, should I be worried if they capture here? No. So there's nothing to fear because the only possible capture black has is this one. If they advance, that wouldn't be a very good idea either. Why? Because simply we could, for example, let's suppose that white plays here, okay? And they play something like, I don't know, I'm just making this up. I don't know what to tell you. Let's chase this bishop away, for example. Black retreats, right? This will be a completely normal move. White keeps up the pressure, right? For example, with this knight. Really, what I'm seeing here is that black never has time to either capture or advance. And if they capture to threaten this pawn, we'll just bring more pieces into the attack. So now you're going to be amazed by the move white makes. Now you're going to be amazed. You're really going to like this move. Here, after this d5, you realize that it really doesn't matter if they capture or advance because we have plenty of chances to win, and white plays the surprising and, at the same time, very strong move d4. Well, surely this would make a lot of you very nervous. There are a lot of central captures here. What could happen? A lot of things could happen. No, don't worry. We've already seen that if they capture this pawn, nothing happens. The only thing we need to check is what happens if they capture this one. We can see that nothing happens there either. What would happen if they capture this pawn? For example, here. Well, the good thing is that this is exactly what happened in the game, so let's watch it live. Would it be a good idea to recapture it? No, it would be a very bad idea. Let me explain. If we capture here now, they would simply capture us with the knight. They'd have won a central pawn, they'd threaten this knight, and especially this bishop. And this position would be very interesting for black. However, do you remember something? By advancing this pawn, what were we threatening? A 6 square. So we're not worried at all because we're attacking this square. And look, after pawn takes pawn, queen takes a6, and this knight, which is undefended, is also under threat. And do you see what Svidler has achieved here? What is this? A passed pawn, which, by the way, I don't know when you're watching this video, but today I'm going to upload a 45-minute class to the Academy about the passed pawn. And I'm going to give you lots of tips for playing with it, both for and against. You're going to love it. For those of you who are in the Academy, just so you know, okay? You'll get an email letting you know. But either way, you'll find it there, okay? It's going to be a completely extra class, and I'm going to upload quite a few of them. If you're not in the Academy, I'll leave the link down below in the description, all right? Very good. So here, the knight is being threatened, and there are two options. The first would be to move the knight away, or the other, which is what happened in the game, pawn takes pawn. If you threaten my knight, I threaten yours. And so here, the exchange has happened. Queen takes knight, pawn takes knight. Important, what do we do with this pawn? Do we recapture it with the bishop? No, that would be a mistake, because if bishop takes pawn, then we would simply be allowing them to exchange here at some point, and well, these pawns would end up doubled, and as we said before, that's not a good idea. First, you should probably play queen to d6 because this bishop's undefended, but it's not a good idea. It seems much better to capture with a knight, and even though this bishop is now a bit trapped, it can get out without any problem because we've opened up the center. The game continues by moving this bishop away from the threat, bishop to d4, while attacking the rook on a1. As you can see, what sets basic players apart from elite grandmasters is that they're always looking to create problems for their opponents, right? Now look at how he creates a problem for the rook. They come to attack the bishop, and now, instead of moving it away pawn by pawn, what they do is defend it with the queen. Pretty interesting, huh? For now, the game is having several exchanges. And wait, because it doesn't end here. Knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, and as you can imagine, bishop takes knight. An interesting moment in the game. A lot of pieces have been exchanged, but if we count, we have queen versus queen, two rooks versus two rooks, and two bishops versus two bishops. And then for pawns, we have 3 against 3 here, and a passed pawn on C for black, and a passed pawn on A for white. Very well. But if we evaluate who's better here, what would you say? Well, probably for the computers, right? For the analysis engines, this is a very similar position. Why? Because both sides had the same thing, same pieces, a passed pawn for each, and the computers can defend against everything. But in practice, who is going to have a playing advantage? Who's it going to be easier to play for? Logically, white. Why? Because look at this passed pawn. Not only is it much closer to queening, but no one is blocking it, and it's also supported by the rook. And not only that, but this bishop can move away, and the other rook can also come to support, right? So here, in practice, the white pieces are much better. But look how interesting this is. Black comes to attack the rook. Probably, by now they had already calculated this beautiful combination that the player with the white pieces, Svidler, executed. However, here you mainly have to calculate 2 moves. The first would be rook to 1, which is not a good move. It's not a good move because here, honestly, the black pieces would still win a rook with this move here. The queen is attacked and the rook is attacked, right? So then you might say, Chessy Cherry, why isn't this move so good? It's because there's a tactical shot. You should always look for tactical shots when there are loose pieces on the board. This piece is loose, meaning no one is defending it, and the move bishop takes h7 would recover the piece and win a pawn. If king takes, then the queen would come over here and capture this bishop. And not only that, but she's also attacking this other bishop. Michael Adams had already foreseen this, and that's why after the check, he moved the king back to h8. The game continues as follows. The bishop basically retreats to its original square and doesn't care if this rook gets captured. Let me explain. Probably capturing this rook would have been interesting, but honestly, it's really scary. Why? Because if the rook is captured, the queen could probably come to e4, threatening the bishop and threatening checkmate. Then f5 would follow, queen to f4, threatening to come in with both bishops, also with the rook, and this would be, well, very dangerous. Very, very dangerous. But be careful, the computers would defend themselves. However, a human would be afraid to capture this rook because the threats are so strong that probably all of us would be scared. So what black does here is play rook to e8. The game continues with rook to 1. Now before it's too late, he says, I'm not going to let you capture the rook. But even so, this looks like a win for black. Why? I'm going to leave you thinking about where you would put that queen. If you want, you can pause the video. You noticed, right? That queen doesn't have a single square. That queen is lost. So here, mistakenly, and this is what often happens to us, the player with the black pieces might think, I'm much better here. I'm going to win my opponent's queen, and they won't be able to checkmate me. And that's correct. But what he evaluated incorrectly is that the queen can be sacrificed. The queen moves to capture the rook. The pawn recaptures the queen, and now the rook comes down to take the bishop. And the material is the same. We're equal in material. Why? Because white has traded their queen for a rook, a bishop, and a pawn, right? So it's 9 points of material against 9 points of material, but white's pieces are positioned much more effectively. Let me explain. This rook is going to come in at any moment. The king's safety is terrible. The two bishops, the strong point is that it's the two bishops, folks, when there's an open position, meaning without pawns. Why? Because they control all the squares on the board. They're extremely powerful. One controls all the light squares and the other all the dark squares. And the combination with the two rooks against this king really makes this position much better for the white pieces. And I'm going to prove it to you, and you're going to love it. Look at how Svidler uses the pieces here, saying, watch how I'm going to do it, okay? The move e5 makes perfect sense. It defends against this bishop. We might think that here a good move would be, for example, to pin this bishop to the queen and then attack it with with the bishop. But actually, the move queen to f6 still defends, and nothing at all would happen here, right? And they get out of the pin. So look at what the white player does correctly here. Besides the material equality and the attack they have on the enemy king, what else do they have that's really strong? Something we seem to have forgotten about. The massive passed pawn that now moves to a6 and is going to be a huge headache. Queen to d7, a7, rook to a8, and this pawn is just one square away from queening. And if you want, you can pause the video right now, because here the white player, Svidler, made a spectacular move that's going to give you goosebumps. I'm going to say it right now. The move is as follows. Rook takes pawn, rook takes on e5, obviously double exclamation mark. Let me ask you, can that rook be taken? Well, no, it didn't happen in the game. But if that rook had been captured, let's try to mentally calculate what would happen. It's not hard to understand, so take a look. If bishop takes rook, this rook comes to h4, given c8, given check, and the king would have to move aside. You see it? And then what would happen? With both bishops given check, the king would have to move, the other bishop would also come in given check, or even more precisely, the rook could come in on the back rank and the king would have to move. For example, after a check, the bishop blocks their exchanges, and since the rook came to check the king, we would capture this rook here, and what happens is that this rook has simply been exchanged for that one, but really, now this pawn can't be stopped from queening in any way. Why? Because when the rook is back here, really the only thing they can do to stop the plan, for example, rook to b1 and queening, would be to threaten this pawn with the queen, for instance, by placing the queen around here. But what would happen then? Well then, since the king would be around here, for example, the rook would sacrifice itself by giving check, the king would have to capture it, and then the pawn would queen. Look, what an interesting version, huh? You can go over it again, or you can try it out yourself on the board so you don't get bored, okay? This is what would happen if black decides to take this gift, to accept this gift. And obviously, they didn't do that. Instead, what they played was this move here, g6, trying to defend against the bishop's entry and, above all, the rooks. And how does the game continue? Well, if the rook can't get in through here, it moves to the fourth rank, where not only does it want to enter through here, but it also threatens the bishop, a bishop that has to move or at least be defended. So now, at the very least, they're attacking this pawn on a7, right? That's what they really want to do. Capture that pawn. But look at how the white player continues, with a lot of patience. Rook to a6 is threatening to come in here with drastic consequences. Black won't be able to defend, but at least they can get this pawn back. And look at what a beautiful way to finish. Rook takes on g6. Do you see what's being threatened with rook takes g6 on that? Mate on the next move. The typical two-rook mate even though there are more pieces on the board, right? So here, black tries to defend against this checkmate. Now, it wouldn't be checkmate if the rook comes over here because the king could escape, although probably not for long, right? The idea here is simply, look how beautiful this is. With the player with the white pieces, Svidler does, he plays bishop to b2, taking advantage of the pressure on this bishop. It can't be captured, even though it looks like a gift, because then it would be mate again. Do you see it? If bishop takes, the rook would come to h4 and it would be mate again. Therefore, here, black tries to play this move, queen to b5, and the subtle bishop to c3 makes it clear that black has to resign here. And I'll explain it to you. These bishops can't be attacked in any way by the queen because all the squares are completely covered by them and the rook. Do you see how important it is sometimes to have bishops on squares in open positions? And the important thing is that now, no matter what black does, this is going to be played. For example, the rook that's on the 4 would move to g4 so that this bishop can't be saved anymore. And not only that, but once this bishop is gone with the 2 rooks and the 2 bishops, it's impossible for this king, completely alone, because he is alone, to be saved. So we've seen here that black incorrectly evaluated that by capturing the queen, they'd be better off. But actually, by capturing the queen, they're worse off. And look at what happened to that. A true work of art. What'd you think? Leave a like if you enjoy this kind of game, and drop me a comment to let me know what you thought, or if you've seen it before. Whatever you want. I always try to read your messages. Remember, today you're going to have an amazing class. I promise you, it's going to be great on pawn chains, on passed pawns in the academy, okay? I'll leave the link for it down below in the description. You already know everything that's included in the academy, besides weekly classes and a ton of other stuff, plus access to 60 opening courses and, well, you already know, right? Come on, chess teacher, stop being so annoying. We already know what's in the academy, man. I might even be a student already, so I'm not going to say anything else about that. I'll just leave it here in the description. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you tomorrow, as always, friends, in the next video. Goodbye.